Okay, welcome back. So, I now have the great pleasure, moving away from some of the security stuff and getting into some more commercial and perhaps more positive issues. I'm very pleased to present Wing Commander Neelu Khatri. She's a CEO of Boston Analytics, and her experience lies in strategic planning, business development. She has significant experience in the global organizations, including private and public sector, working with top management and consulting, and transformation, change, and in top management roles. So, without further ado, please, Commander.
I think after the previous panel, I feel pretty ineligible to be standing here at the forum. But I will try my best to talk about some of the experiences I've had in the 20 years plus in the sector. I think at this point in time, India as the industrial capability power, we may not have very great successful stories here, but in my personal experience, especially in the last 7 to 8 years, have been really profound. So I have seen little shacks in Bangalore and Hyderabad, which are primarily suppliers to ISRO and HAL and DRDOs, and doing some really good stuff. For example, one of the things that I remember all the time is, I walk up into one of these alleys of Bangalore, and there is this one young guy who actually gets married to a girl when he's working into a global corporate culture. So obviously he's selected by the father of the lady, not because of anything else, but because of the job he had in the MNC. And a couple of years down the line, he gives it all up and opens up the a manufacturing unit, which I'm sure his father-in-law, if he knew it earlier, would not have got his daughter married to him. But goes on to make the blades of advanced light helicopters in his little shack. And so some of the experiences that I've had has been very, very profound. And I thought it would be good to share at this forum. What is it that actually brings, is it green? Yeah, sorry, I was going backwards. So what is it that's pushing the aerospace, space, and military industry in India? Obviously, in this particular scenario, it's the global, I would say, the pie in the space segment that's increasing. If you look at it, India is significantly lower than some of the large nations like India and China, like US and China, but incredibly increasing. So you still are looking at $1.5 to $1.9 billion spend every year. Most of this spend actually comes from ISRO. It's actually, a pity that you still have a lot of 48 to 49 small SME, small businesses supporting ISRO, but you haven't seen very credible relationship coming out of it. And one of the things that I would say on this regard is somehow our industry, especially in the space segment, has primarily been based on contract manufacturing for the global companies, for the national company like an ISRO. And the moment we are to step up from this relationship towards, I would say, strategic partnership with the industry, that's where you will see the change. If you see this industry, globally, it looks like, it's a satellite versus non-satellite industry, whereas government is a predominant player on the non-satellite regime, primarily being used for military, data-dependent global economy, private investment, and technology advancements. The other thing is, how do we look at India as from the global scenario? Again, as I say, numbers might look really small, but some of the interesting reads I've had, in my experience has been that primarily because of the relationship that India has developed with 30 or 35 countries, It's been evolving as more like a launch pad for the global partnerships. Cost has been a very, initially, which I would say initially people talked about, most of the Indian space missions were extremely frugal. But I think over a period of time, that's now coming up as one of the feathers in our sleeves that we can do something for a few $1 million, which the Western countries have been, doing a $70 or $100 million plus kind of programs. So that's come somehow in the last 2 or 3 years' time. Instead of being a flag, it's now becoming a brag point for us. So I think we should continue to continue on the path of whether you call it Make in India or collaboration with the global companies, because India now emerges more as not just a low-cost destination, but a destination that has great engineering talent, that has great obsolescence support management system, engineering outsourcing hand-holding, which is happening in India. Commercially, you see a lot of global companies, really going into some really cool stuff. You see Google and Facebook getting into space-based internet. You see PayPal and Amazon going into reusable launchers. I have a very good examples. I know my friend Sushmita standing there from Earth to Orbit, doing a lot of cool stuff. But most of these startups or privatized space ventures in India, and I'm sure Sushmita will speak much more about it, and a huge amount of teething challenges they face, just in terms of utilizing their capability or operationalizing what they want to do. So do we have enough government support for them? Do we have enough assured businesses? Do we have enough financial or banking support to them? I would have my doubt over those. Another page that you see is talking about the space budget. I would say some of the great changes that have happened in the last 2 or 3 years, or some of the remarkable achievements that have happened from probably to 2014 onwards till 2018-19, are what is marking India as a very credible space player in the globe. I'm not really reading out, I'm not going through it. I'm sure from morning onwards we've heard a lot of technical capabilities of our country. Where I'm going to really now head and spend some time and experience is some of the strengths and challenges of this industry. Primarily, 2 or 3 things on the strength, right? So one is our program has primarily been self-reliant, which is very credible for a country like India, which has really not been a manufacturing or a designing nation on its own for other industries. So if you've seen automobile as an industry grew up in the last 15, 18 years. Probably hospital equipment manufacturing has grown up in the last 7 to 8 years in India. But apart from that, if you talk about other industries, it's primarily been an aggregated agriculture or IT infrastructure, back-end engineering support kind of a nation that we look at. And so with that kind of a background as a nation, coming up with its own strong space capabilities of launching and designing right from scratch, I think that's been an incredible point for us that we should be proud of. We've been cost effective, I talked about it. I can say it's largely not driven by politics. It's a very personal thought, and I know a lot of people can debate on it. But primarily, I see it more as being driven by a bunch of scientists who may be getting visionary statements from the political scenario, but yet, by and large, free from political ditto. What are the constraints here? Obviously, the first constraint is that it never has enough budget, and therefore it learns to work with the constrained budgets it gets. Is there a good supportive ecosystem that an organization like ISRO has created. I would like to believe that ISRO officials think they do have a very good ecosystem. I would challenge that. I think what exists today is a very contract manufacturing relationship between the organization and the private sector. None of the companies that actually support ISRO could be free of, I would say, ex-ISRO officials themselves sitting and seeing an opportunity and understanding, or having the passion for the industry and therefore after retirement or pre-retirement gets into in hand with the organization. The second is, I mean, I keep talking to many of my bankers. One of my work in this industry has been that I work with the bankers to create fund that could actually get into technology companies. And I always wonder, whenever we take any targets for aerospace or space-dominated industry, there's always a no from the funds. The primary reason is that some of those companies or all of those companies are hugely dependent upon, for their orders or existent on the government. And they come or they don't come. And if you get those orders, you're flying high on a high tide. But if you don't, it's literally a zero downside. I mean, an absolute slip up on whatever business plan that you put up for the next 3 to 5 years. And that's a huge risk for the industry. So is there any adaptation by the organization like an ISRO for these companies? The answer is, to my mind, it's negative. They never get a sight of what the long-term manufacturing objectives are, and therefore the businesses align themselves on creating that capability or creating that kind of a strategic path for themselves. It's not there, and that's where there's a huge slip up of the banking industry or the funds really thinking seriously about the Indian startups on space or the manufacturing small businesses here. The policy framework is definitely missing on a national level. And not just that, I think I see a lack of state governments hand-holding support for technology manufacturing for the Indian businesses. Do you get any kind of tax rebates? Do you get any kind of advantages of being in the SEZ? I think those are areas which needs to be really looked up apart from that banner of Make in India. How do you operationalize that banner of Make in India for the companies that are really out as private sector to work in this industry? Oops, yeah. Few pointers. As an industry, if you look at the capability of some of the Indian conglomerates, the small businesses, I think the one thing that emerges out really nice is the rise of engineering outsourcing companies in India. So if you look at 10 to 11 years back, what started up like a Tech Mahindra or a Cyient or a Wipro, HCL, some of these companies actually started up as back-end engineering sourcing offices for the global companies. But if you see, what they're doing now, I always get amazed whenever I go and visit them. So there are about 9 or 10 companies in India that actually do $1 billion business just on aerospace engineering in India. They could be, Hyderabad, Noida, Bangalore, Chennai-based companies having offices across the world, really working with, the Lockheed Martins, the Rolls-Royce, etc. of the world. And is it just cost that some of those work is getting transferred into India? I would like to challenge that. It's not. It's the engineering talent. It's the way the Indian teams have been able to support the obsolescence management to those global companies. It's the agility to work on development projects. That's been a great up for India. Some of these global companies, and I would also include Honeywell into it, and this has been my personal experience. About 3.5 years back, we set up a small team back in Bangalore to set up contracting mechanism for global supply chain. So you handed over a list of non-core activities that needs, manufacturing products that needs to be outsourced to the global industry. And just because you happen to sit into one of the Indian cities, you obviously look at some of the engineering or manufacturing companies across in the region, and you want to include them as a part of one of the receivers of the tenders if they can respond. And in the last 2-3 years, I've seen at least 40 to 45 companies actually getting listed or approved as suppliers to the global OEMs. If you also talk about companies like Boeing and Dassault, probably Honeywell itself, GE, Safran, Altran. There's a huge list of endless names. Almost all of these companies in the last 5 to 6 years have actually opened up their engineering centers in India, apart from giving their work to the Indian engineering companies. So why is it happening? And if it is happening, does it mean that there is dearth of talent in India? No. I think it's the dearth of appropriate talent which needs to be handheld by the global companies or global operations here. So the biggest need in the sector today, if you were to look at the private sector or private industry participation, has been how do you hunt for the right opportunities? How do you look for funding into those causes or those business cases that have been identified? And how do you get the right talent for manufacturing and running for it? I think I will just end up my talk primarily on a few synergy that I see as more as an industry, just being by virtue of being in this industry. So you're talking about space as a growth industry in India. You're talking about civil aviation growth here in India. I mean, from a 500 plus aircrafts, you're actually looking about 1,200 more aircrafts to be, getting inducted in the next 7 to 8 years. The requirement for MRO of aerospace in India. We already know about the budget for Indian defense, whether it's the Army, the Air Force, the Navy. You're talking about a $60 billion plus every year. In all, the requirement on the technology, on the engineering, on the manufacturing composites is pretty, I would say, overlaps onto each other. Yet we don't have a credible industry on this huge opportunity that we keep talking about. I think that's a question of concern. Thank you so much.
We've still got a few minutes for questions, but I think I'll ask the first question. Commander, I have $5 million. I want to invest in some Indian space sector. What would you recommend?
I think to start with, I have personally seen, so what do you need to start up a new business? One is not just a business opportunity, but the capability to go and deliver on that opportunity, right? So you might have certain opportunities, but many times you don't get the right capabilities to go deliver over it. To my mind, if it was my $5 million, I would go bet it on the engineering sector, engineering services sector, because that's probably the first step into any industry. If you get that right, you then step up to manufacturing, and then of course, system integration and systems.
Are there any particular space components that India is doing exceedingly well, like perhaps better than anyone else in the world?
I don't think so. You can't pinpoint onto certain. Most of the small businesses that you see, or some of the successful ones, are still into precision sheet metal bending, etc. A lot of it on the engineering services, as I keep talking about. And in that, you have various, from electrical to avionics to a low complexity engine work to some of the others, but I think it's really tough to say which one could it be?
I saw a question in the back. We'll take a few. First one, all the way in the back. Let's take 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll answer them all together. Please.
First of all, to Daniel, you said you have about $5 billion, and there are great opportunities in the country to invest. And sorry, Neil.
Hypothetical dollars.
Indian industry is doing a hell lot. I mean, one of the points you mentioned in your last slide was about 80% of the launch vehicle and 50% of the satellite being sourced from the private sector. The capability very much exists in the country today to put up its own launch vehicle. I'm talking about the private sector. And of course, putting together the satellite. So there is immense capability, much more than what probably you feel about people working at a component level. People are working at system level. I thought I would just clarify, not a question.
In the back?
Oh, it's me you're talking about in the back, right? That's me? Super. So when you look at different markets, talk about US, there's always companies that, I'm talking about budgetary requisition. There's always companies that sort of spearhead that effort, liaise, and lobby at the highest level. So you've got the Boeings in the US, you've got Airbus and Arianespace in Europe. What companies do you think can sort of lead that initiative in India? I know that we don't have those major corporations in India when it comes to the space sector, but there needs to be some dialogue that they need to be having at the highest level to sort of get more funding or at least some more support. As you said, the hand-holding initiatives that must be taken out.
So it's tough to pinpoint on a particular global corporation to say that they're doing a great job in spearheading any project. How some of these global companies actually function is, they would have their global projects identified and defined and, have the ground rules of operationalizing it defined. And many times, just the capability in the Indian industry actually then trickles down to portions of those projects getting implemented in India. I would define it that way. You need to look at this industry from a view which is, from a height. If you see that, you see a government company which works very close. And I'm not being critical of ISRO as such. Great organization doing a lot of job. But the fact remains that it keeps the projects to itself. The fact remains that the companies that participate with them are still contract manufacturing capability or contract manufacturing partnership, not a strategic partnership at a very visionary level. Let's say 3 years or 4 years down the line, is ISRO planning to do something massive with one of the Indian companies or global companies? I don't see that happening in an earth-shattering way. So if you actually ask me which organization has a very credible India plan, to my mind, I don't have a name that pops up. Because I've been part of 2 or 3 major global companies, but they are primarily bringing portions of their global projects in India, primarily because they think it can be executed well in India. And that decision could have come from any part of the world, and India competes, whether it's with the Eastern Europe or South America or Brazil kind of countries, and India wins it on merit of cost optimization or engineering talent.
Thank you.
I'm afraid we're actually running out of time. So if you have additional questions, please, you can talk to her afterwards. I'm sure she'd be more than happy to. Sorry, I'm already being asked to cut to the coffee break. So if you'd like to speak to her afterwards, you're more than welcome.
They are moving away from contract manufacturing. Dr. Pillai is here, he's an authority, right? He will spot me on this. We are moving away from that, subcontract manufacturing. We are moving into a place where satellites are being manufactured within these facilities by selected companies. And more than 80%, I would say 95% of PSLV is being done by the industry. That's all.
This is good to know. Thank you very much. If anybody else has any questions, please feel free to speak to the wing commander during the coffee break. Thank you very much.